You are not broken. That's the first thing you need to hear. There is nothing fundamentally wrong with you for feeling this way. If you've been carrying a quiet sense of dissatisfaction, a subtle emptiness that shows up in the middle of ordinary days, it doesn't mean you're weak, ungrateful, or incapable of happiness. It means you are paying attention, and most people are too distracted to do that. We live in the most comfortable era in human history. We have climate-controlled homes, instant access to knowledge, constant entertainment, unlimited options. We solved many of the problems our ancestors spent centuries trying to survive. And yet, in the middle of all this progress, something strange happened. We became restless, not dramatically miserable, not visibly collapsing, just unsettled. A low, persistent hum in the background of our lives that says, "This can't be it." And maybe the reason you feel this way is not because you failed at life, but because you followed the script perfectly. You did what you were told. You tried to build something stable. You tried to improve yourself. You tried to stay productive. You tried to stay informed. You tried to stay connected. You tried to become better, more disciplined, more efficient, more attractive, more valuable. You optimized your mornings. You tracked your habits. You consumed advice. You compared progress. You set goals. You chased milestones. And for a moment, every achievement felt like it might finally silence that quiet inner tension. But it never lasted. The satisfaction faded faster each time. The next goal replaced the previous one. The bar moved. The comparison shifted. And instead of feeling fulfilled, you felt like you were constantly catching up to a finish line that keeps relocating. The uncomfortable truth is that modern life is designed to stimulate you, not to satisfy you. Everything around you competes for your attention. Your focus is monetized. Your time is measured. Your emotions are analyzed. The more you scroll, the more you see what you could be, who you could become, where you could travel, what you could earn, how you could look, how you could live. And slowly, without realizing it, your baseline shifts. Ordinary life starts to feel insufficient. Silence feels unproductive. Rest feels guilty. Being average feels unacceptable. And the tragedy is that none of this happens violently. It happens quietly, gradually, rationally. You are not sad because your life is terrible. You are tired because your mind is overstimulated. You are not hopeless because you lack opportunity. You are overwhelmed because you have too many options. And when everything is possible, nothing feels meaningful. Choice, which once represented freedom, begins to feel like pressure. If you can become anything, then why aren't you further ahead? If information is unlimited, why don't you know enough? If connection is instant, why do you still feel alone sometimes? These questions don't scream, they whisper. And whispers are harder to escape. For generations, happiness was tied to survival and stability. Food, safety, community. Now those are often assumed. So the target moved. Happiness became self-actualization, personal branding, constant growth, visible progress. And when happiness turns into a performance, something inside us fractures. Because we are no longer allowed to simply exist. We must optimize existence. We must improve it, document it, share it, upgrade it, compare it. And in doing so, we subtly turn ourselves into projects rather than people. There's a concept in psychology known as hedonic adaptation. It means that humans quickly return to a baseline level of happiness after positive or negative changes. The new car excites you for a while. The promotion feels validating for a moment. The new relationship feels electric at first, but eventually it becomes normal. Your nervous system recalibrates. What once felt extraordinary becomes expected. And then you need something slightly bigger to feel the same emotional impact. This isn't a flaw in your character. It's a feature of your biology. But in a world built on constant novelty, that feature becomes a trap because the system around you knows that satisfaction fades. So it keeps offering you the next upgrade before you can sit long enough to question why the last one didn't change everything. And here is where it becomes deeply philosophical. What if the problem isn't that you haven't achieved enough, but that you were trained to chase stimulation instead of meaning? Stimulation is immediate. It feels good quickly. It requires little reflection. Meaning is slower. It requires discomfort. It asks you to confront silence. And modern culture does not reward silence. It rewards visibility. It rewards speed. It rewards reaction. The more reactive you are, the easier you are to engage. The easier you are to influence. The easier you are to keep in motion. Motion feels like progress, but movement without direction is just distraction. If any part of this resonates with you, if you've ever felt that subtle gap between what you have and how you feel, consider subscribing and staying with this channel, because these conversations are not about surface motivation. They are about understanding the deeper architecture of modern experience. And when you understand the structure, you stop blaming yourself for reacting to it. Now, let's go further. One of the most powerful illusions we've internalized is the belief that happiness is the default state we should be maintaining, that if we are not consistently content, something is malfunctioning. But historically, human life was not optimized for continuous pleasure. It was built around survival, cooperation, and periodic relief. Moments of joy were meaningful precisely because they were rare. Today, comfort is constant, but so is comparison. And comparison quietly erodes contentment, not because you are greedy, but because your brain evaluates your status relative to others. When you constantly see curated success, your internal scale recalibrates. You don't compare your life to the average human across history. You compare it to the most visible, filtered highlights of millions of people. And of course, that will distort perception. The result is a subtle but persistent sense that you are behind. Behind financially, behind socially, behind professionally, behind physically, behind spiritually. Even when objectively you are stable, safe, and functioning well, this is not weakness. It is exposure. Exposure to more lives than your nervous system was designed to process. And here lies the paradox. The more connected we become digitally, the more individualized our struggles feel internally. You can message anyone instantly, yet hesitate to admit you feel lost. You can broadcast your thoughts publicly, yet struggle to articulate them privately. You can consume endless advice, yet still feel uncertain about what actually matters to you. Because advice without reflection becomes noise, and noise slowly disconnects you from your own internal compass. Maybe the reason you feel empty sometimes is not because you lack ambition, but because you've been running on borrowed definitions of success. Definitions that were handed to you by culture, by metrics, by algorithms, by trends. And if you chase a definition that doesn't align with your internal values, even winning feels hollow. The uncomfortable realization is this: you can do everything right according to the external system and still feel internally misaligned. And that misalignment doesn't scream, it hums. It shows up as mild dissatisfaction, as restlessness, as scrolling without purpose, as difficulty sitting still, as the inability to enjoy what you already worked for. But none of this means you are doomed to feel this way. It means you are at a crossroads, because the moment you recognize the pattern, you gain distance from it, and distance creates awareness, and awareness is the beginning of meaning. This is not a call to reject modern life. It is not a call to abandon ambition. It is a call to slow down enough to question whether the goals you are chasing are truly yours, whether the life you are optimizing is aligned with your deeper values, whether the happiness you were promised was ever meant to be constant or simply occasional. And maybe the most liberating thought of all is this: you are not supposed to feel extraordinary every day. You are supposed to feel human. Good. We'll go deeper. Same tone, no dramatic exaggeration, no emotional manipulation, just clarity. What makes this modern emptiness difficult to identify is that it doesn't look like suffering. It looks like normal life. You wake up, you function, you meet responsibilities, you laugh occasionally, you consume content, you go to sleep. Nothing catastrophic happens. And yet, in quiet moments, there is a subtle question. Is this all? Not in a hopeless way, not in a desperate way, just in a curious, slightly unsettling way. And that question is powerful because it signals awareness. It signals that your mind is beginning to notice the gap between stimulation and meaning. Let's talk about stimulation for a moment. Your brain evolved in an environment where novelty was rare. New experiences were unpredictable and often dangerous. So your nervous system developed a powerful response to novelty. It releases dopamine not as a reward for pleasure, but as a motivator for pursuit. Dopamine is about anticipation, not satisfaction. It pushes you forward. It says, keep going. There's something valuable ahead. In a natural environment, this system kept you alive. In a digital environment, it keeps you scrolling. Every notification, every short video, every headline, every new piece of information triggers a small spike of anticipation. You are constantly leaning forward psychologically, waiting for the next thing. And when the next thing arrives, it delivers a brief hit of engagement, not fulfillment. The cycle restarts almost instantly. The problem isn't that you lack discipline. The problem is that you are immersed in a system optimized to stimulate pursuit without offering depth. Over time, your baseline shifts. Silence feels uncomfortable because silence offers no stimulation. Slow tasks feel exhausting because they compete with high-speed input. Deep focus feels unnatural because your attention has been fragmented into microbursts. And when your mind becomes accustomed to constant input, meaning begins to feel inaccessible. Meaning requires sustained attention. It requires reflection. It requires boredom. And boredom, in modern culture, is treated like a flaw rather than a doorway. You've probably noticed this yourself. When you try to sit quietly without distraction, your mind becomes restless. It searches for something, anything, a thought, a plan, a memory, a notification. That restlessness is not proof that you are broken. It's evidence that your brain has adapted to continuous stimulation. And adaptation is neutral. It simply reflects your environment. But here's the deeper issue. When your internal reward system is trained to expect constant novelty, ordinary life begins to feel flat. Routine feels dull. Long-term projects feel heavy. Relationships feel less exciting over time. Not because they lack value, but because they lack novelty. And if you mistake novelty for meaning, you will constantly abandon depth in search of intensity. Intensity is easy to find. Depth is not. Intensity is loud. It demands attention. It promises transformation. Depth is quiet. It unfolds slowly. It doesn't announce itself. And modern life has conditioned us to respond to what is loud. This conditioning also affects how we see ourselves. You are exposed daily to curated fragments of other people's achievements, career milestones, fitness transformations, travel highlights, financial wins, public recognition. Even vulnerability is sometimes packaged and optimized for engagement. And your brain, without conscious intention, builds an internal comparison model. You measure your invisible struggles against someone else's visible highlights. That comparison is fundamentally distorted, but it feels real. Comparison activates evaluation. Evaluation activates pressure. Pressure activates anxiety. And anxiety narrows perception. When perception narrows, you focus more on what you lack than on what you have. Not because you are ungrateful, but because your attention is guided toward gaps. And a mind that constantly scans for gaps cannot experience contentment for long. The paradox is that we have more metrics than ever to measure progress. Followers, income brackets, productivity apps, performance dashboards, analytics. We can quantify nearly every aspect of our lives. But what cannot be quantified begins to feel less legitimate. Peace cannot be graphed. Contentment cannot be displayed. Presence cannot be ranked. So subconsciously, we begin to prioritize what can be measured over what can be felt. And this is where the philosophical layer becomes unavoidable. For much of human history, meaning was externally structured. Religion, community, tradition, and shared narratives provided a framework. Your role was clearer. Your identity was anchored in collective stories. In modern secular societies, many of those structures have weakened. This isn't inherently negative. It created freedom. But freedom without structure can become overwhelming. When external meaning dissolves, the responsibility shifts inward. You must define your own purpose, create your own values, construct your own narrative. That sounds empowering. And it is. But it is also heavy. Because if meaning is self-created, then any lack of meaning feels like a personal failure. You can no longer blame fate, destiny, or rigid social structure. The pressure becomes internalized. If you feel empty, maybe you didn't optimize correctly. If you feel lost, maybe you chose the wrong path. If you feel average, maybe you didn't push hard enough. This internalization intensifies self-criticism. And self-criticism, when chronic, erodes self-trust. When you stop trusting your own instincts, you rely more on external validation. More advice, more trends, more frameworks, more productivity systems. And the more you outsource direction, the further you drift from internal alignment. It's subtle. You don't wake up one day feeling alienated from yourself. It happens gradually. You say yes when you want to say no. You pursue goals because they seem impressive, not because they feel meaningful. You stay busy to avoid confronting uncertainty. You define success in ways that look good publicly, but feel hollow privately. And eventually, you reach a strange point where everything appears stable from the outside, yet internally, you feel disconnected. That disconnection is not dramatic enough to alarm others. It doesn't disrupt your functionality, but it creates a persistent background dissatisfaction. Now, here's something important. Dissatisfaction is not always negative. In fact, it has evolutionary value. It pushes growth. It motivates improvement. The problem arises when dissatisfaction becomes your constant baseline, when no achievement quiets it, when rest feels unearned, when gratitude feels forced, when you are unable to enjoy the present because you are mentally positioned in the next milestone. You were told that happiness would arrive once you reached a certain point, a salary, a relationship, a version of yourself. But what if happiness was never meant to be a permanent state? What if it was meant to be episodic, brief, contextual, fleeting? And what if trying to hold on to it constantly is what creates tension? There is a difference between pleasure and meaning. Pleasure is immediate. Meaning is cumulative. Pleasure peaks and drops. Meaning builds quietly over time, but meaning often feels neutral in the moment. Writing something meaningful might feel difficult while you're doing it. Building a relationship might feel ordinary most days. Working toward mastery might feel repetitive. But over months and years, those investments create a deeper sense of coherence. Coherence is different from excitement. Coherence means your actions align with your values. Your time aligns with your priorities. Your direction aligns with your beliefs. And when there is coherence, even ordinary days feel grounded. The modern environment rarely encourages coherence. It encourages optimization, speed, visibility, reaction. It nudges you to adjust constantly, to pivot quickly, to chase trends. To remain flexible and adaptive. Adaptability is valuable, but constant adaptation without stable values leads to fragmentation. And fragmentation feels like emptiness. If this reflection resonates with you, if you recognize yourself in these patterns, take a moment to like this video, not for validation, but because engagement allows conversations like this to reach others who may be silently questioning the same things. And if you want to continue exploring the psychological and philosophical structure behind modern life, subscribe and stay. We are not looking for quick fixes here. We are looking for understanding. Now let's address something deeper. Loneliness. Not physical isolation, existential loneliness. You can be surrounded by people and still feel unseen. You can maintain constant digital interaction and still feel internally separate. Existential loneliness emerges when you feel that your inner world is not mirrored or understood. And in a culture that rewards curated identity, vulnerability often feels risky. So people present stable versions of themselves, competent versions, successful versions, even when internally they feel uncertain. This creates a feedback loop. Everyone appears composed, so you assume you are the only one struggling. You hide your uncertainty to maintain composure. Others do the same. And collectively, everyone feels slightly alone. The tragedy is not that we lack connection. It's that we lack depth in connection. Depth requires time, presence, discomfort, honest conversation. But depth is slower than stimulation. And slow experiences are easily displaced by fast ones. So the question becomes, how do you live meaningfully in a system optimized for distraction? The first step is not rebellion. It is awareness. Awareness interrupts autopilot. When you notice that you are chasing intensity instead of alignment, you gain choice. When you recognize that comparison is distorting perception, you gain perspective. When you understand that constant happiness is unrealistic, you release unnecessary pressure. You don't need to escape modern life. You need to navigate it consciously. And maybe the most radical act in a world of acceleration is deliberate slowness, not laziness, not withdrawal, but intentional pacing, choosing depth over volume, conversation over broadcast, mastery over novelty, reflection over reaction. This doesn't guarantee constant happiness. Nothing does, but it increases coherence, and coherence reduces emptiness. You were never meant to feel extraordinary every day. You were meant to experience contrast, effort and rest, doubt and clarity, discomfort and growth. The attempt to eliminate all discomfort creates fragility. The attempt to feel amazing all the time creates anxiety. Instead of asking, "Why am I not constantly happy?" maybe a better question is my life aligned with what I actually value? That question is quieter, but it is more powerful. And we're just getting started. Good. Let's continue. Alignment sounds simple in theory, but in practice, it requires something most people avoid: honesty. Not public honesty, private honesty. The kind that happens when there is no audience, no performance, no external validation. The kind that asks uncomfortable questions like, if no one could see my life, would I still choose this path? Or, if this achievement brought no recognition, would it still matter to me? These questions cut through illusion because they remove applause from the equation. And once applause is removed, many motivations quietly collapse. We rarely admit how much of our ambition is shaped by visibility. Status is a powerful psychological force. It signals safety, belonging, and influence. Historically, higher status meant better access to resources and protection, so your nervous system is deeply wired to care about how you are perceived. In modern culture, perception is amplified. Your identity can be observed, evaluated, and quantified at scale. And that constant potential evaluation subtly shifts behavior. You don't just live, you curate. You don't just experience, you document. You don't just improve, you compare. Over time, this creates a split between the performed self and the private self. The performed self is optimized. It is efficient, composed, progressing. The private self is more uncertain, more inconsistent, more human. The greater the gap between these two versions, the more internal tension you feel, because maintaining a performance consumes energy. And eventually, exhaustion appears, not necessarily physical exhaustion, but existential fatigue. Existential fatigue feels like being tired of performing competence, tired of chasing improvement, tired of pretending clarity when you feel uncertain, tired of optimizing every corner of your life. And when that fatigue sets in, many people misinterpret it as laziness or lack of discipline. But often, it is simply the nervous system asking for integration, for the performed self and the private self to become more aligned. Integration requires vulnerability, at least internally. It requires admitting that you don't have everything figured out, that progress is nonlinear, that doubt does not equal failure, that confusion is part of growth. But modern culture rarely showcases confusion without quickly resolving it into a lesson. We prefer transformation arcs, before and after narratives, clear outcomes. Ambiguity is uncomfortable to watch, yet ambiguity is where most of real life happens. There is also another factor shaping modern dissatisfaction: acceleration. Everything is faster. News cycles, career progression, skill acquisition, communication. Even trends in identity and belief shift rapidly. Acceleration creates pressure to adapt continuously. If you slow down, you fear falling behind. But constant acceleration destabilizes depth. Deep relationships require time. Mastery requires repetition. Self-understanding requires reflection. And reflection cannot be rushed without losing clarity. When your environment accelerates, but your psychological processes require slowness, tension emerges. You feel behind, not because you are incompetent, but because you are human. Human cognition evolved for gradual change, not relentless update. And when update speed exceeds processing speed, anxiety increases. Not dramatic panic, just low-grade tension. This is why many people feel restless. Even during rest, they sit down to relax, but cannot fully detach. There is always something else they could be doing. Improving, learning, responding, advancing. The idea of doing nothing feels almost irresponsible. But without moments of mental spaciousness, your identity becomes entirely defined by output. And when identity equals output, any dip in productivity feels like a threat to worth. Worth tied to productivity is fragile. It fluctuates with performance. It rises with achievement and falls with mistakes. That volatility keeps you in a cycle of self-monitoring. You begin to evaluate yourself constantly. Am I doing enough? Am I growing fast enough? Am I maximizing my potential? These questions appear ambitious, but when chronic, they create pressure without peace. Let's pause on that word, potential. Modern culture is obsessed with it. You are told that you have unlimited potential, that you can become almost anything with the right mindset and effort. This belief is empowering on the surface, but it has a hidden cost. If your potential is unlimited, then any ordinary outcome feels like underperformance. If you could become exceptional, then being average feels like waste. And because average is framed as failure, you never allow yourself to simply exist without improvement. But what if being human includes limitation? What if limitation is not a flaw, but a boundary that gives life shape? A painting with infinite canvas has no focus. A life with infinite expectations has no stability. Accepting limitation doesn't mean surrendering growth. It means choosing direction consciously instead of reacting to every possibility. This is where philosophical depth becomes necessary. For centuries, thinkers wrestled with the tension between freedom and responsibility. When external structures weaken, the individual must construct meaning. But constructing meaning requires commitment, and commitment means saying no to other paths. In a world of endless options, commitment feels risky, because choosing one direction means losing others. Yet without commitment, you drift, and drifting feels like emptiness. Emptiness is not always absence. Sometimes it is diffusion, energy scattered across too many directions, attention fragmented across too many inputs, goals layered without hierarchy. You are busy, but not centered, engaged, but not grounded, informed, but not oriented. Orientation matters. Knowing why you are doing something stabilizes effort. Without a clear why, even meaningful tasks feel draining. You can work hard and still feel unfulfilled if your actions are disconnected from your values. And values require reflection, not trends, not algorithms. Reflection. Ask yourself quietly, what do I value when no one is watching? Depth or visibility? Stability or constant novelty? Mastery or quick recognition? Community or individual status? These are not moral questions. They are alignment questions. And misalignment is often the silent root of dissatisfaction. Another subtle influence on modern unhappiness is the myth of emotional control. You are encouraged to optimize your mindset, reframe quickly, eliminate negativity, stay positive. But emotions are signals, not malfunctions. Sadness signals loss. Anxiety signals uncertainty. Frustration signals blocked goals. When you treat every uncomfortable emotion as something to immediately fix, you miss the information embedded within it. Constant self-correction creates self-surveillance. You monitor your feelings the way you monitor productivity metrics, and that monitoring increases tension. Instead of allowing emotions to move through you naturally, you analyze and adjust them prematurely. The result is emotional shallowness, high functioning, but internally disconnected. Disconnection from emotion leads to disconnection from meaning. Because meaning is not purely intellectual, it is felt. It emerges when your actions resonate with your internal world. If you are numb, meaning becomes abstract, and abstract meaning cannot compete with concrete stimulation. So perhaps the real issue is not that life is empty, but that your relationship to experience has been conditioned towards speed, comparison, and optimization. When everything becomes a project, you forget how to simply participate in your own existence. Participation is different from performance. Participation is being present in conversation without calculating impression. It is working towards something because it matters to you, not because it will be impressive. It is resting without guilt, because rest sustains clarity. It is choosing depth in at least one area of life and allowing it to unfold slowly. This shift sounds small, but psychologically, it is radical, because it removes external metrics as the primary source of direction. And when external metrics lose dominance, internal values gain space. If this conversation is helping you reflect differently about your own patterns, take a moment to engage with the video, not out of obligation, but because thoughtful engagement signals that there is demand for depth in a fast environment. And if you want to continue building a space where we question the assumptions of modern life without dramatic exaggeration, subscribe and stay. The goal here is not intensity. It is clarity. Now let's address the fear beneath much of this restlessness, the fear of insignificance. In a world of billions, it is easy to feel small, not metaphorically small, but statistically small. Your individual actions seem minor relative to global scale. Your voice competes with endless others. And when visibility becomes conflated with value, invisibility feels like irrelevance. But value is not synonymous with scale. A meaningful conversation with one person can carry more psychological weight than broadcasting to thousands without connection. The problem is that scale is measurable, depth is not, so scale becomes the default goal. More reach, more growth, more exposure. And while expansion is not inherently wrong, chasing scale without grounding can amplify emptiness, because expansion without identity creates instability. Identity is not the same as branding. Branding is how you are perceived. Identity is how you orient yourself internally. When branding dominates identity, you become reactive. When identity guides branding, you remain stable even as perception fluctuates. Stability does not mean stagnation. It means rootedness. And rootedness reduces existential anxiety. When you know what you stand for, when you know what you prioritize, when you know what you are willing to sacrifice, external noise loses some of its power. The modern world will not slow down for you. It will continue accelerating. It will continue offering upgrades, comparisons, distractions, and opportunities. The question is not whether stimulation will exist. It will. The question is whether you will consume it unconsciously or engage with it selectively. Selective engagement requires boundaries. Boundaries around attention, around time, around values. And boundaries are difficult because they require saying no. No to certain opportunities. No to constant availability. No to endless comparison. But every no protects a yes. And without protection, your energy dissipates. Dissipation feels like emptiness. Concentration feels like meaning. Meaning does not arrive dramatically. It accumulates quietly, through consistent choices aligned with values, through relationships nurtured over time, through projects pursued for intrinsic reasons, through self-understanding built slowly. You may not feel euphoric every day. You may still experience doubt, boredom, frustration. That is not failure. That is texture. A textured life contains variation, and variation creates depth. The promise that you would always feel fulfilled was unrealistic. The promise that you could build a coherent, intentional life is realistic. But coherence requires conscious participation. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath modern dissatisfaction. You are not broken. You are overstimulated, overexposed, and under-reflective. Once reflection returns, clarity follows. And once clarity follows, emptiness begins to transform not into constant happiness, but into direction. And direction, even more than happiness, sustains the human mind. Direction changes everything, not because it eliminates uncertainty, but because it organizes it. When you have direction, obstacles feel like part of a path. Without direction, the same obstacles feel random and exhausting. This is why two people can experience similar challenges and interpret them completely differently. One sees struggle as evidence of movement. The other sees it as proof of failure. The difference is not intelligence or talent. It is orientation. But orientation cannot be borrowed permanently. You can be inspired by someone else's vision, but you cannot outsource your own. Eventually, you have to decide what matters enough to endure difficulty for. Because every meaningful pursuit includes difficulty, the idea that the right path will feel smooth is another modern illusion. Smoothness is often a sign of low resistance, not high meaning. This is where many people become disillusioned. They assume that if something feels hard, it must be wrong. But difficulty and misalignment are not the same. Misalignment feels draining in a hollow way. Difficulty within alignment feels challenging but grounded. The difference is subtle but powerful. When you are aligned, effort feels purposeful. When you are misaligned, effort feels pointless. So how do you recognize alignment? Pay attention to what exhausts you and what depletes you. Exhaustion from meaningful work often comes with a sense of completion. Depletion from misaligned work comes with resentment. Exhaustion says, "That was demanding, but worthwhile." Depletion says, "I don't know why I'm doing this." Learning to distinguish between those two states is essential. Another signal of alignment is time perception. When you are deeply engaged in something that resonates with you, time distorts. Not because it is easy, but because your attention is unified. Fragmented attention makes time feel chaotic. Unified attention makes time feel immersive. And immersion is one of the purest forms of psychological satisfaction available. Modern life fragments attention constantly. You rarely do one thing at a time. You switch between tasks, tabs, conversations, inputs. Each switch carries a cognitive cost. Over time, fragmentation becomes your default mental state. And when your mind is always partially elsewhere, you cannot experience depth fully. You live in half presence, half engaged in everything, fully engaged in nothing. Half presence amplifies emptiness. Full presence builds meaning. Presence does not require dramatic change. It requires constraint, choosing to focus on one task, one conversation, one idea. It requires resisting the impulse to check, to switch, to update. And that resistance feels uncomfortable at first because your brain expects novelty. But discomfort during focus is temporary. The reward is depth. Depth stabilizes identity. When you invest deeply in something over time, you begin to see yourself as someone who commits, someone who builds, someone who sustains effort. That identity creates internal strength. It reduces the need for constant external reassurance. External reassurance is addictive. Compliments, likes, validation, they feel good quickly, but they are unstable. They depend on audience. When reassurance fluctuates, your mood fluctuates with it. When identity is internally constructed through aligned action, it becomes less volatile. Volatility contributes to modern emotional swings. High stimulation days feel exciting. Low stimulation days feel dull. But a life built only on peaks is unsustainable. Peaks require recovery. If you chase constant intensity, your baseline erodes. And when baseline erodes, even moderate experiences feel flat. Rebuilding baseline requires recalibration. Not elimination of pleasure, but moderation of input. Allowing boredom occasionally. Allowing stillness. Allowing thoughts to surface without immediately covering them with noise. Many people fear what arises in silence, but silence is not the enemy. Silence reveals what stimulation hides. What does stimulation hide? Unprocessed emotion, unclear priorities, suppressed doubt, deferred decisions. When you are constantly busy, you postpone confrontation with these internal elements. Busyness becomes a buffer. But buffers accumulate pressure. Eventually, avoidance manifests as anxiety or dissatisfaction. Facing your internal world is not dramatic. It is gradual. You begin by noticing patterns. When do you reach for distraction? After conflict? During uncertainty? When you feel inadequate? Awareness reveals triggers, and once triggers are visible, choice becomes possible. Choice restores agency. Agency reduces helplessness. Helplessness fuels emptiness. This is why understanding the psychological mechanisms behind your feelings matters. When you label emptiness as personal deficiency, you feel powerless. When you recognize it as a predictable response to overstimulation and misalignment, you regain control. Not total control over circumstances, but influence over orientation. There is another uncomfortable truth to consider. Comfort can weaken resilience. When friction is minimized in every area of life, tolerance for discomfort decreases. Minor inconveniences feel overwhelming. Delayed gratification feels intolerable. Long-term projects feel burdensome. But resilience is built through exposure to manageable difficulty. If your environment eliminates most friction, you must intentionally introduce challenge. Physical training, skill development, difficult conversations, creative effort. These are not punishments. They are anchors. Anchors stabilize identity in an accelerating world. Without anchors, you drift toward whatever stimulus is strongest at the moment. And the strongest stimulus is rarely the most meaningful. It is simply the most attention-grabbing. Attention is your most valuable resource. Not money, not status. Attention. Where your attention goes, your experience follows. If your attention is constantly directed outward toward comparison and novelty, your internal world weakens. If some of your attention is redirected inward toward reflection and value clarification, coherence strengthens. Coherence does not mean certainty. You will still doubt, you will still question. But doubt with incoherence feels exploratory. Doubt without coherence feels destabilizing. Another layer of modern dissatisfaction comes from unrealistic narratives about fulfillment. You are shown final forms, not developmental phases. Completed projects, not messy drafts. Established confidence, not early insecurity. Polished outcomes, not repeated failures. This skews expectation. You assume that once you find your path, clarity will be permanent. In reality, clarity fluctuates. Even aligned individuals experience confusion. The difference is that they expect it. Expectation shapes perception. If you expect life to feel consistently inspiring, normal days feel disappointing. If you expect variation, normal days feel acceptable. Much of modern unhappiness comes from mismatched expectation, not catastrophic reality. Let's address ambition directly. Ambition is not the enemy. Growth is not the enemy. The problem arises when ambition becomes compulsive rather than intentional. Compulsive ambition is driven by fear. Fear of falling behind, fear of insignificance, fear of wasted potential. Intentional ambition is driven by curiosity and value alignment. Both can produce similar external outcomes. Internally, they feel completely different. Fear-driven ambition rarely satisfies because fear is insatiable. Once one threat is neutralized, another appears. Value-driven ambition may still involve stress, but it is anchored in meaning. Meaning can coexist with stress. Fear cannot coexist with peace. Peace does not mean absence of challenge. It means absence of internal fragmentation. When your actions align with your values, even stressful periods feel integrated. When your actions contradict your values, even calm periods feel uneasy. This brings us to a subtle but powerful shift in perspective. Instead of asking, "How can I be happier?" consider asking, "How can I be more aligned?" Happiness may follow alignment, but alignment can exist without constant happiness, and alignment is sustainable. If this reflection is prompting you to reconsider how you measure progress, take a moment to engage with the video. Conversations like this grow not through sensationalism, but through thoughtful participation. And if you want to continue exploring the psychology behind modern life and build a more grounded internal framework, subscribe and stay connected. This space is about depth over noise. Now consider this. You are living in a transitional era. Traditional structures weakened. Digital structures strengthened. Individual freedom expanded. Collective certainty decreased. It is natural to feel unsettled in transitional periods. Societal evolution is not smooth. It is disorienting, and individuals internalize that disorientation. Recognizing that your discomfort may be contextual rather than purely personal reduces shame. Shame intensifies isolation. When you remove shame, you create space for honest evaluation, and honest evaluation is the foundation of intentional living. Intentional living does not require drastic change. It requires conscious choice, choosing where to invest energy, choosing which comparisons to ignore, choosing which values to prioritize, choosing when to disengage from noise. These choices accumulate, and over time, accumulation becomes identity. Identity built consciously feels stable. Identity built reactively feels fragile. Fragility increases emptiness because fragility demands constant reinforcement. Stability allows rest. Rest is not weakness. Rest is integration. It is where experience settles into understanding. Without rest, experience becomes blur. With rest, experience becomes narrative. And humans need narrative. You need to feel that your life is not random fragments, but a story with continuity. Continuity emerges when you pause long enough to connect moments, to see patterns, to adjust direction. Without pause, life feels like acceleration without memory. Memory gives meaning to effort. Effort gives structure to time. Structure gives direction to existence. And direction reduces the quiet emptiness that brought you here in the first place. You are not behind. You are navigating complexity your ancestors never encountered. The goal is not to eliminate complexity, but to respond to it with awareness rather than impulse. Awareness slows reaction. Slowed reaction increases choice. Increased choice strengthens alignment. Alignment builds coherence. And coherence transforms emptiness into orientation. Orientation is not glamorous. It will not always look impressive, but it feels stable. And stability in a hyper-stimulated world is rare. And rare things are valuable. Rare things are valuable. And in a world where attention is constantly fragmented, psychological stability becomes one of the rarest assets you can build. Stability doesn't mean rigidity. It doesn't mean refusing to grow or change. It means having an internal center that doesn't collapse every time the external environment shifts. Think about how often the external world changes your internal state. A piece of news alters your mood. A comment shifts your confidence. A comparison disturbs your peace. A missed opportunity triggers self-doubt. When your internal state is constantly reactive to external input, you live in psychological turbulence, and turbulence is exhausting. The modern world is optimized for reaction. Outrage spreads faster than nuance. Urgency spreads faster than reflection. Drama spreads faster than depth. If you consume information without boundaries, your nervous system absorbs that urgency. Even if your personal life is stable, your mind feels tense. You carry the emotional weight of events far beyond your direct control. This creates a subtle sense of instability. The ground never feels fully solid because you are mentally plugged into a constantly shifting global feed. Historically, most humans were influenced primarily by their immediate environment. Now, your immediate environment includes the entire world. That expansion increases awareness, but it also increases cognitive load. Cognitive overload reduces clarity. When you process too many inputs, your decision-making weakens. You become more impulsive, more reactive, more likely to seek short-term relief rather than long-term coherence. And short-term relief rarely resolves long-term dissatisfaction. This is why discipline, in the modern context, is less about extreme productivity and more about selective exposure. What you allow into your mental space matters. Not every update deserves your attention. Not every debate requires your opinion. Not every trend requires your adaptation. The ability to ignore strategically is powerful. Ignoring is not ignorance, it is prioritization. When you prioritize intentionally, your life begins to simplify, not externally, but internally. You stop trying to keep up with every narrative. You stop measuring yourself against every benchmark. You choose fewer metrics, and fewer metrics create clearer focus. Clarity reduces anxiety because it reduces ambiguity about direction. When you know what you are building and why, external noise loses influence. You may still hear it, but it doesn't dictate movement. Movement driven by noise feels frantic. Movement driven by values feels steady. Steadiness is underrated. It is not flashy. It doesn't generate immediate excitement. But over time, steadiness compounds. Small, consistent actions aligned with values produce more fulfillment than dramatic bursts of unsustained effort. This is another hidden trap of modern culture. It glorifies intensity, the dramatic transformation, the overnight success, the radical pivot. But intensity without sustainability leads to burnout. And burnout deepens emptiness because it reinforces the belief that effort leads to collapse. Sustainable growth is quieter. It respects limits. It incorporates rest. It accepts imperfection. It understands that progress is cyclical. There will be phases of expansion and phases of consolidation. Both are necessary. Consolidation is where identity strengthens. It is where lessons integrate. It is where skills stabilize. Without consolidation, expansion becomes chaotic. With consolidation, expansion becomes structured. Structure reduces existential drift. Drift often feels like freedom at first. No constraints, endless possibility. But without chosen constraints, possibility becomes paralysis. When everything is available, choosing feels risky. You hesitate. You delay commitment. You keep options open. And while options remain open, direction remains undefined. Undefined direction amplifies the question, is this all? But when you commit intentionally to a path, you trade infinite options for depth, and depth transforms experience. You begin to see nuance, and others overlook. You build competence, others lack. You develop relationships rooted in shared investment. Meaning grows in specific soil, not in scattered ground. Let's return to the core idea. You are not broken. You are responding to an environment of abundance, acceleration, and exposure. Your restlessness is not evidence of failure. It is a signal. A signal that stimulation alone is insufficient. A signal that comparison distorts perception. A signal that alignment matters more than intensity. You may never eliminate dissatisfaction completely, nor should you. A small degree of dissatisfaction motivates reflection and growth. The goal is not permanent happiness. It is dynamic balance, engaging fully with your life while accepting its variability. There will be days that feel ordinary, days that feel heavy, days that feel inspired, days that feel uncertain. None of these states define you permanently. They are weather patterns, not identity. Identity is shaped by repeated choices. Repeated choices build trajectory. Trajectory creates narrative, and narrative gives meaning to effort. If you look back at your life as a sequence of random reactions, it will feel fragmented. If you look back at your life as a sequence of intentional choices, even imperfect ones, it will feel coherent. Coherence satisfies something deep within the human mind. It reduces existential anxiety because it provides continuity. Continuity does not require extraordinary achievement. It requires awareness. Awareness of why you chose what you chose. Awareness of what you are willing to sacrifice. Awareness of what you refuse to compromise. Sacrifice is unavoidable. Every choice sacrifices alternative futures. The key is choosing sacrifices consciously rather than accidentally. When sacrifices are unconscious, regret grows. When sacrifices are intentional, acceptance replaces regret. Acceptance is not resignation, it is clarity. Clarity simplifies internal conflict. When internal conflict reduces, mental energy frees up, and freed energy can be invested in creation rather than comparison. Creation builds agency. Agency reduces emptiness. Even small acts of creation matter. Writing, building, learning, helping, designing, teaching. These acts reinforce the belief that you are not merely consuming reality, but participating in shaping it. Participation combats passivity. Passivity amplifies dissatisfaction. If you find yourself consuming more than creating, consider rebalancing, not drastically, gradually. Shift a portion of your attention from intake to output. Expression clarifies thought. Contribution strengthens identity. And if this reflection has shifted even one perspective for you, engage with it. Let the algorithm know that depth has value. And if you want to continue building an internal framework that withstands external noise, subscribe and stay. We are constructing understanding, step by step. Now, let's move toward the closing insight. Modern life promised constant happiness. That promise was unrealistic. What it can realistically offer is opportunity. Opportunity to choose consciously, to build intentionally, to connect meaningfully. But those opportunities require effort beyond consumption. You will still feel uncertain at times. You will still question direction. But questioning is not weakness, it is awareness. And awareness is the beginning of wisdom. Instead of chasing a permanent emotional high, aim for structural stability. Instead of eliminating all discomfort, build resilience to it. Instead of comparing constantly, clarify privately. Instead of optimizing endlessly, align intentionally. The emptiness you feel is not a void to be filled with more stimulation. It is space. And space can be frightening because it demands responsibility. But space is also possibility. Possibility to define values, to choose direction, to live deliberately rather than reactively. You are not late. You are not defective. You are navigating complexity with a brain designed for simplicity. Once you understand that, self-judgment softens. And when self-judgment softens, reflection deepens. When reflection deepens, alignment strengthens. When alignment strengthens, emptiness transforms not into endless happiness, but into grounded direction. And grounded direction is enough. This concludes the core message. If you stayed until this point, you are not looking for distraction. You are looking for clarity. Stay connected if you want more conversations that challenge modern assumptions without noise or exaggeration. Depth is rare, and choosing depth, especially now, is an act of strength.